Hello, everyone, and welcome uh, to our first webinar using the Zoom platform. Thank you for joining us for Leading the Charge, what sets entrepreneurial leaders apart and how we can help them succeed. We are very excited to have you here, and we're excited to connect and learn with you today. My name is Lucy Sullivan. I'm the head of marketing for MRG, and I'm going to be your host today. So before we begin, I will cover a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording today's webinar, so you'll get a link to the recording, the slides, a blog post summing it up all later this week. We also have a terrific research summary that'll be coming your way. And if you've joined us before, you may have noticed, like I said, we're on a brand new platform. This is our first webinar on Zoom. And it shouldn't be a drastic change, we don't expect, but you will look for Q&A in a slightly different place at the bottom center of your screen. If you hover, you'll see that Q&A icon come up and a little window will appear, and that's how you get your questions to us. We welcome those questions anytime throughout the session. We're happy to have them. We do have everybody on mute so that we can get through the material efficiently, but type any questions you have as they come up, and we'll pause for questions a couple times during the broadcast. Any questions that we aren't able to answer online today, you will hear from us offline, and we'll also put those in our summary Q&A blog post, so you'll be able to read what other people were asking. There's always a lot of good conversation in there. So again, bear with us just in case anything is unusual in our settings, but this is our first one with Zoom, but we're really looking forward to it. It's a great platform that I know a lot of people are getting familiar with quickly right now. So a very brief introduction of who you'll be hearing from today and who MRG is. MRG, we're a global leader in designing assessments that impact people in profound and meaningful ways. We have solutions for leadership, personal development, motivation, sales, service, and our assessments are really designed to provide feedback that fosters very deep self-awareness and inspires action and encourage people to pursue lasting growth. And our assessments are used by thousands of certified practitioners all over the world in over 100 countries. And we've been doing this for a very long time, for over 35 years. And from all of those assessments, we get a lot of terrific data. And from that data, we get a lot of amazing research. So that's what our material is based on today that you'll be hearing. And your presenters today are Tricia Naddaff and Maria Brown. Tricia is the president of MRG. She's been working with individuals, teams, organizations all over the world for more than 30 years in consulting and coaching, product design, research. She shares MRG's learnings around the world. She's been a TEDx speaker, contributor to Association of Coaching magazine. She's spoken at conferences in the US and many other countries. And Maria is the head of research at MRG. She has a PhD in psychology from Vanderbilt. She's conducted amazing award-winning research. She's presented at SIOP, the Society of Consulting Psychology, and she has a tireless curiosity for research. So it's a joy to have her with us and to be hearing from her today. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Tricia Naddaff for just a moment to get us started.
Hi all. So if you've joined us before, you know it's not usual for us to start with video. But since it's not such a usual time, we thought we would just welcome you a little bit more personally. So we hope you're all doing well, navigating the new normal. I'm sure most of us are experiencing a few things that are the same, like we've probably never washed our hands as much as we have over the last few weeks. We are probably all marveling at how much we touch our faces and never realized. Many of us are sharing homes in ways that we haven't before as we try to navigate the rhythms of families all together in one space without the traditional structure of work and school. So we hope you're all doing well. We have always been very committed to community, to our broad MRG community, and to creating learning environments. And so thank you for taking the time out of your world right now to be with us. We really appreciate it. Our research always makes more sense when we gather with practitioners and we talk together about what we're learning in the research and what we're all learning in the practitioner space. So this really is an invitation to participate today with us, share your insights, Share your questions, share your musings. We want to hear it all. Our schedule has changed, as probably it has for many of you. So you'll be hearing more from us in the coming days and weeks about ways we want to gather community, share learnings, and offer spaces for conversation. So thank you again for being with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to my lovely colleague, Maria, who's going to start us off.
Thank you, Tricia, and thank you, Lucy, and hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. And you know, as Tricia mentioned, there's a lot going through our minds right now, but it's nice to find some time to think about some other things and focus on some other problems that we might be thinking about. So the concept or the idea of entrepreneurship has been very popular in recent years. And we are very excited to share our recent exploration of this topic with you. Now, we have a lot to cover today, and we say that a lot, but we do. Our research, you know, we're very driven by research, and we like to share it all with you so that we can start that conversation and get your feedback about what you're seeing in these results as well. So our presentation is divided into 4 main parts. First, we are going to describe what is currently known about entrepreneurs, okay? And this will allow us to establish some common ground before we describe the motivation for the research we're sharing today. We will then spend some time describing some new research findings based on a group of entrepreneurs. And our goal is to better understand entrepreneurs by looking at their behavior profile. And then we can use this profile to develop some advice, come up with some advice that'll help us coach them to their strengths, while at the same time figuring out what potential pitfalls they might find in their leadership journey. As with any group of human beings, there are variations in the entrepreneur profile, and we will talk about some of those variations, particularly gender and generation. And finally, many of us are working with non-entrepreneurs who may want to become more entrepreneurial, or we are working with organizations that have incorporated some level of entrepreneurship into their competency models. And so we will use some of the main points and takeaways from the studies we'll be discussing today to describe what we feel are the hallmarks of entrepreneurship. Okay, and we'll talk about how we can use them to coach leaders and organizations that are interested in this concept and applying it further. So before we get started, we thought it might be nice to get to know you, our audience, and see where you are in coaching entrepreneurs. So we would like to know, are you currently coaching entrepreneurs? And there are 3 options. Yes, I'm currently coaching 1 or more entrepreneurs. No, not now, but I have in the past. Or no, but I'm curious about entrepreneurial leadership. So please let us know where you are in coaching entrepreneurs.
Thanks, everyone. We're starting to see those votes come in, and we'll give everyone just a minute or 2 to click their choice. All right. And here are the results. So 47% of our audience is currently coaching 1 or more entrepreneurs. 22% are not presently, but they have in the past. And 31% are curious about entrepreneurial leadership, but not coaching an entrepreneur at present.
Well, thank you very much, Lucy. So we can see the vast majority of you are or have worked with entrepreneurs in the past, but everyone is at some level interested in entrepreneurial leadership. So we really look forward to sharing this with you and letting know what you think. Feel free to share your experiences when you ask questions through our Q&A. So let's start by establishing some common ground. Okay, there are many themes associated with the concept of entrepreneurship. Okay, anecdotally, we associate it with many different characteristics, and the ones we're listing here come from just a simple web search. What do you find when you look up, what characterizes an entrepreneur. And some of the most common ideas involve things like risk-taking, high rewards, thinking differently. There seems to be a lot of consensus around that. But what do we actually truly really know about entrepreneurs? And for that, we would like to rely more on the empirical research. And fortunately for us, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of research looking at this particular group of leaders. For example, while they tend to ideate at higher levels, right? They generate ideas more frequently and a larger number of ideas than other leaders. They don't engage in counterfactual thinking. And that involves thinking about alternative realities for things that have already happened. So for example, wondering what would have happened if you hadn't taken a wrong turn on the way to the meeting, then perhaps you would have gotten there on time. It seems like they find it easier to move on to the next problem rather than dwell on problems of the past. They've also been shown to be quicker at switching between cognitive tasks and cognitive goals. So they can change from working on one thing to the other more quickly than the rest of us usually can. They also show some social skills in comparison to other types of leaders. But some of these skills require starting off with some level of social capital and opportunities that may not be available to others. So things like social competence can come from having a high level of social capital, educational attainment, which isn't available to everyone, and having entrepreneurial business knowledge, which would require interacting with entrepreneurs at some level. And while these are very useful to know, these are things that characterize entrepreneurs, they aren't always very practical in a consulting setting. Okay? Some of them are difficult to measure consistently in a consulting setting. So think about measuring counterfactual thinking reliably in that space. Others are difficult to change or modify in practical ways because they might require large amounts of time, things like higher educational attainment, or because they involve complex constructs that have to be broken down into their components. Something like social competence would be a good example of that. And so our view is that there has to be an easier way, in a more practical and useful way, to describe entrepreneurs. One that is more useful in a consulting setting. And so we are going to focus on identifying overt, observable behaviors that characterize entrepreneurs. Now, why do we think this is a better approach, an easier approach? Well, it's easier to measure and to interpret, right? It's easier to measure. These are behaviors that are seen. They're easy to recognize. You don't need to really stretch any kind of interpretation. You just report what you're seeing. This can lead to greater agreement. So everyone who's observing an entrepreneur or someone who's describing themselves would identify the same set of behaviors for the most part. They're easier to describe both when you're asking people to identify them, but also when you're giving feedback to that entrepreneur. Right? We're not talking about abstract concepts or anything that requires any stretch of the imagination. You report what you see. We know from our research and others' research that behavior is modifiable through concrete changes. We also, through our research, can identify the strengths and the weaknesses of different behavior patterns. And for those of you who are familiar with our research library, we have a lot of this and we share it openly. So by focusing on something that's easy to identify, easy to change, and supporting it with research, we think that we have something that's really actionable and can be really helpful for people coaching entrepreneurs. So this is the approach we're taking today. We're going to start with a group of entrepreneurs, and then we're going to describe them behaviorally and take it from there, figure out what we do with that behavioral description. So let's start looking at our initial research. First, we're going to look at the behavioral profile of entrepreneurs, and then we'll discuss what it all means. So a little bit about our study and our group of entrepreneurs. So we were able to find 467 entrepreneurs, and we defined entrepreneur as one of two. They had to either be the founder of an organization or the president or CEO of a startup. And we recognize that there exist many different ways of describing or operationalizing the concept of entrepreneur, but we wanted to take this functional approach based on what their role is in an organization and use that to then build a behavior profile. These 467 entrepreneurs completed the LEA self-assessment, which I will describe in the next slide, and a subset of them, 111, completed the full LEA 360, which involves observers as well. We have mostly male entrepreneurs in our sample, but this is likely a reflection of what you would find out there when working with entrepreneurs. Several industries and several countries are represented. We use the North American norm for all our analyses, and I'll talk a little more about that when we look at some of the first results. So as I mentioned before, we use the LEA, the Leadership Effectiveness Analysis, for this research. And the LEA is a widely used multi-rater assessment that consists of 2 questionnaires. Now, it is one of MRG's assessments. It's one of our assessments, which actually gives us access to participant data covering decades of leadership, which is wonderful from a research perspective. The observer questionnaire is filled out by bosses, peers, and direct reports, and it measures 22 leadership behaviors and 31 leadership competencies. And the behaviors are the main part that we're going to focus on today. The self-questionnaire measures the same 22 leadership behaviors, but from the perspective of the leaders themselves. And the self-questionnaire also includes 3 research items, measuring level of self-confidence, authenticity, and growth mindset, from which we've done other research. So if you're interested in that, please reach out and we'll share that with you. Now, all of our entrepreneurs completed the LEA self. A subset, 111 of them, completed the full 360 process, which involved the observer questionnaire as well. So let's look at what we found. So what you can see on your screen right now is the leadership profile of entrepreneurs. These are median scores for the group of 467. This uses LEA self data, and you can see percentile ranks are on the left side and LEA behaviors are listed in the bottom. Now there's a lot to see here, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. What I would like to do is talk about what stands out in this profile. So let's look at those different behaviors. So here are the behaviors that stand out in that entrepreneurial profile. Now, when we say that they place higher emphasis on a behavior, what we mean is that their score was high in comparison to the norm group, in this case, the North American norm group. And so this is what we have. They tend to place higher emphasis on excitement or engaging others in a high energy manner and generating excitement. They place a higher emphasis on delegation, so asking for help, delegating tasks, giving others the opportunity to use their talents. They emphasize persuasion or being persuasive. They sell ideas. They win people over. So that's on the high emphasis side. Lower emphasis means their score was low in comparison to the norm group. And what we found here was they place lower emphasis on cooperation or helping others, putting the team's interests first and ahead of their own. They tend to place less emphasis on structuring or ensuring organization and setting guidelines. And they place less emphasis on deference to authority. And so this is less emphasis on deferring decisions to those in positions of authority. Now, because they're already high up in the authority hierarchy, what this likely refers to are board members, investors, partners, the other people that they need to interact with in that sense. So we've got 6 different behaviors here that they tend to emphasize a little more or a little less. And what we'd like to do next is look at what this means, right? So as with any pattern of human behavior, the entrepreneurial profile suggests potential benefits and liabilities. So let's start by looking at the strengths of the entrepreneurial profile. And these are things that we want to make sure they maintain in some way. Now, we saw that they were high on persuasive and higher on excitement. They emphasize those behavior sets, which leads us to infer that they are good at selling ideas. And not just that, but they built energy around those ideas. They were higher on delegation and lower on structuring, which means they're likely to give others room to grow and to try new ideas. Right? And they do this without restricting them too much. They had lower deference to authority. So they don't appear to be bound by rules or opinions of authority figures, which gives them, in a way, more freedom to trust their gut and trust their own opinions. So this is, these are the benefits of the entrepreneurial profile. Let's look at the shadow side, the potential liabilities of this entrepreneurial profile. They may not be open to challenges from others, and we see this with their lower deference to authority. And we all know that being closed to other perspectives can be a problem in some situations. So it's at least worth it to consider why this is their approach. They may let ideas take flight without providing much support and structure. And we see that with high delegation and low structuring. And we've already talked about this combination as a potential a positive factor within the profile, but it's all about balance, right? So it's great to defer and to give people freedom to try things out, but at some level, you're giving them too much of that. So it's important to find that right balance. Another potential liability is that they may find it easy to break with standard procedure. And this is due to their lower structuring and lower deference to authority. And oftentimes procedure is there for a reason, so it's important to take that into account rather if you're considering going off and doing your own thing. Finally, they may appear selfish or appear to lack interest in helping others. And we see that with the lower cooperation scores. And it's important, and this has shown up in other research as well, they need to make sure that they're reciprocating appropriately so as not to lose some of their social capital. So consider why they're not helping out as much as they potentially could. Now, as we all know, the patterns demonstrated by this research may not apply to every single entrepreneur, but they highlight areas that should be evaluated as part of that developmental process. So these are worthy conversations for all of us to be having with entrepreneurs that we're working with. So now we've talked a little bit about the profile. We've talked about some of the advantages of that profile and some of the potential pitfalls or disadvantages. So let's explore further. By our definition of entrepreneurs, they are a subset of top leaders, right? So they function mainly as presidents or CEOs of an organization. And while it is important to understand that full behavior profile that we just talked about, it's also useful to identify which of those behavioral tendencies are specific to the entrepreneur and which are a consequence of their role as president or CEO, right? So now the next step for us is not just to understand how they're behaving, but what is it about being an entrepreneur that leads to some of these things we saw in the profile. So our next goal was to identify the uniqueness, what is unique about entrepreneurs, by comparing them to a similar group of presidents and CEOs from the same countries and the same industries. Now we're going to give you guys a chance to play a game with us. And we love doing this. It's hypothesizing, thinking about what we're going to find in our data. So before we tell you what we found, we would like you to think about your own experience working with entrepreneurs as well as working with other presidents and CEOs, and let us know what you expect to find. When compared to other presidents and CEOs, I think entrepreneurs are more open to input from others and less likely to work autonomously, less open to input from others and more likely to work autonomously, or C, I don't expect to see differences between the two groups. So let us know what you expect to find in the results.
Thanks, Maria. Folks are voting now, so I'll give you a moment just to read those through and make your best guesses. And then Maria will share the exciting answer. All right, we've got just about everyone weighing in. And let's see where we ended up. All right. So 18% think that they'll be more open to input. 72%, a large majority, think they would be less open to input, and just 10% don't expect to see any differences between the two groups.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. Wow, we've got a good, a good set of scientists listening in today. So the correct answer is B. Of course, we're asking you to base this on your experiences, which might differ depending on the individuals you've worked with. And of course, not everyone listening in today has worked with entrepreneurs. But good job, guys. Most of you selected B, which is the correct answer. Now I'm going to show you some of that and some of our other findings up next. So here you see the behavior profile of both entrepreneurs in blue and presidents and CEOs overall in green. The profiles don't look very different. They seem to move together for the most part. But of course, this is science. We're going to look for statistically significant differences, and that's exactly what we did. Now, before I show you the full set of results, I want to just share a quick note with you. So the following sections, we'll talk about this, entrepreneurs compared to other presidents and CEOs. We'll talk about males versus female entrepreneurs and so on. We will use the terms higher and lower to describe some of these behavioral differences, but I think it's important for all of us, myself included, to remember that these are relative terms and not absolute. So when we say that one group is, say, higher on deference to authority, we're not saying that they are high, just that they are higher than the other group. So let's keep in mind that it's relative and not absolute. But with that in mind, let's look at some of the main distinguishing factors. So entrepreneurs tended to place higher emphasis on maintaining and using their professional or technical expertise and relying on that to make decisions. They were also more likely to act autonomously or independently. On the other hand, they were less likely to seek and use input from others, which we measure by our consensual measure. They're less likely to show deference to authority and defer to those in positions of authority when making decisions and things like that. And were less likely to let others know exactly where they stand. Now, several themes emerge from these differences. When compared to other presidents and CEOs, entrepreneurs are less likely to rely on input from others. Okay, that's higher self, lower consensual, lower deference to authority. They spend less time giving feedback. That is that lower feedback, perhaps because they themselves don't necessarily take input from others, so they might assume that others don't need it or want it. And they use expertise in their area of specialty more than other presidents and CEOs, and we saw that in the technical score. So in summary, when compared to other CEOs and presidents, entrepreneurs are more likely to rely on self-expertise, while non-entrepreneurs tend to consider more information, a broader set of contexts, and different perspectives when they're making decisions. Okay, so we've covered a lot. I think it might be a good time to open up for some questions, so I'll let Lucy share some of what she's gotten so far. And Trisha,
Yes.
feel free to jump in.
We have some great questions coming in. Thanks, everyone, and feel free to keep them coming. We'll just take one or two in the interest of time, and we'll answer the rest offline, or you can catch them on our blog. One question is, I thought that the self would be a higher score because of those ideation strengths. So do you have any theory as to why that's a lower score?
So Maria, are you all right if I take this one?
Go right ahead.
All right, so thanks, Ronald. That was actually a great question. You saw that the self was slightly higher in the entrepreneurs than in general presidents and CEOs. So there is a little bit of distinction there, but it's not extraordinarily high. And so there is some interesting, we're going to get to some insights from the observers, which I saw was Jonathan's question. So we're going to transition to a little bit of insight from the observer perspective. And I think when we look at the competency differences between the presidents and CEOs versus the entrepreneurs, we're going to see a potential insight about why those self scores may not be as high as some of us would have expected. Maybe given some of the entrepreneurs we've worked with, certainly given the reputation of the entrepreneurs. So yes, currently we know they're a little bit higher than presidents and CEOs, but there are some insights in the competencies we're going to share in just a minute that might explain why they're not even higher.
Thanks, Tricia. In the interest of time, and because some of these terrific questions are actually going to come up in our second half, and I don't want to have to rush through it, I'm going to go ahead and let you go on, Maria, but folks, do keep those coming, and I think a lot of you will have your questions answered very soon.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Tricia. And actually, I'm going to hand it over to Tricia now. Talk about blind spots.
Great, thank you. I actually love talking about blind spots. So for those of you who've been hanging around us for a while, you know this is one of the areas that's pretty consistent in our research when we have the benefit of having both self and observer feedback. Blind spots, as we define them, are places where the leader's perception of him or herself is different than how his or her observers see that person. So we're really looking, when we look at a group, how does this group of leaders, how do they tend to see themselves, and how do these larger group of observers tend to see them? So this is what we're looking at here. And we usually find actually quite a number of blind spots. In this instance, we did not find too many. We only found 2. So the first one is entrepreneurs tend to overestimate how much they delegate. So entrepreneurs tend to describe themselves as delegating more than their observers describe them, the amount that they delegate. So perhaps there is a sense here that they feel like they're delegating, they feel like they're giving freedom, but perhaps they are hovering a bit more, perhaps they are giving assignments with a little bit more specificity than they imagine. Perhaps a level of emotional intensity makes the person who is receiving the delegated task feel like they have a little bit less freedom. So there could be many reasons why this gap exists. The second is they underestimate how much they rely on their expertise. This is the technical score in the LEA. So these the leaders themselves, the entrepreneurs themselves are saying, you know, I emphasize technical a fair amount. However, their observers are seeing them truly emphasize at a higher level how much they're using their expertise. So they're the answer people, right? They're the people who can be seen as or feel that they are the smartest person in the room. They have the answers. They have the experience. They know what they should be doing. So it's an interesting juxtaposition here with this, this perhaps a little less freedom, a little less delegation, and a little bit more reliance on technical expertise having the answer. However, as I said earlier, this is less, this is a fewer number of blind spots than we usually see. So we feel pretty confident in the research that we've shown you earlier in this presentation that relies on self, because the self matches the observers in 20 out of the 22 behaviors. So that's a pretty good ratio. All right, so but we do have some good observer data, and what we have in the observer questionnaire that does not live in the self questionnaire are 31 competencies, traditional measures of leadership that look at the observer perspective of how well does this leader do this, how successful is this leader in this particular competency. So in this graph, what you'll see is two colors. I hope you can see two colors. Green at the top, which are representing the competencies where observers rated the presidents and CEOs higher than observers of entrepreneurs rated them. The gray means there's no difference, right? There's no difference in effectiveness across these two populations. There are no competencies in which the entrepreneurs were rated higher than the presidents and CEOs. So let's zoom in and take a look at these 6 competencies where the CEOs were rated as higher than the entrepreneurs. There are 6 of them, but you can kind of think of them in 2 different clusters. One cluster being what we're calling psychological resilience, right? Psychological resilience as measured by demonstrates self-confidence and tolerance for ambiguity. So if we reflect back on Ronald's question about, hey, we would have expected self to be a little bit higher than the general population of leaders. And again, while we saw that self a little bit higher, that independence of thought, the independence of action, higher relative to the presidents and CEOs, we didn't perhaps see it as high as we thought. And so we don't know what the reason is, but a hypothesis is when a leader is seen as demonstrating a little bit less self-confidence and demonstrating a little bit less tolerance for ambiguity, you can see that perhaps they look a little bit less confident in that whole self arena where you're thinking and working sort of in a more autonomous way. A wonder we would have is, does the excitement influence this? So excitement is how much you're revealing your emotions, how much enthusiasm, but it is emotional expression. So potentially are entrepreneurs revealing more the shadow side of their emotions as well as the light side of their emotions? Is their self-doubt, is their anxiety, is their uncertainty a little bit more available to others, and therefore they're seen as having a little bit less tolerance when things are shaky or unknown, and they're seen just in general as perhaps a little bit less self-confident. So that's one category that we think might be related to the self. The other category is very broadly sort of business acumen, business knowledge, sort of organizational capability, right? So business aptitude, financial understanding effectively leads organizational change and ability to get things done through people. So our hypothesis is, while entrepreneurs can come from many different places, some of them have never had a lot of time in traditional organizations. They've been entrepreneurs their whole career. Some of them exited out of traditional organizations, maybe because it wasn't a fit, and found their way into an entrepreneurial space. But most presidents and CEOs have spent a career in organizational life. And so they have learned competencies associated with organizational life and organizational leadership. Probably they have experienced more coaching, mentoring, traditional leadership development, both inside and outside the organization. Their network is probably grown over their career to be other leaders of organizations. And so their set of competencies in the space of this broader organizational effectiveness has probably grown through their career at a higher and faster rate than perhaps with the entrepreneurs. So the series of hypotheses, more to go. This is, I'm not sure if we said it at the beginning, but this is our first study in this area. And so we will continue to study this as more data comes in and share with you as we go along. And to our colleague who asked about the Dutch, I saw that question. We'll share, we'll send out some country differences more broadly. It probably will not be a surprise to the person who asked this question that There's a broad difference between how the Dutch and the US lead in general, so we might expect that to translate into the entrepreneurial space. But we have a ways to go in data gathering before we can really take a deep dive into how the entrepreneurial profile differs across countries. However, we do have enough data to look at a couple of demographic differences that we are very fond of looking at when we look at leadership populations. So the first of that is entrepreneurial differences relative to men and women. We are big fans of looking at gender similarities and differences, and we were fortunate to have enough data to take our first look at this. And so when we looked at differences between men and women, the first thing we looked at are where do female entrepreneurs differ from their male counterparts based on behaviors that they use more than their male counterparts. So that's our study here. We found 6 behavioral differences. The first is technical, again, how much expertise they're using in the space. So both men and women are high, women just are a little bit higher. The second is self. We've been talking about, again, both men and women tend to be higher than their presidential and CEO counterparts. Women, though, entrepreneurs tend to be demonstrating self, that autonomous way of thinking and acting more than their male counterparts. Women tend to demonstrate more empathy than their male counterparts. They also tend to be more outgoing, so more social, more just kind of in general friendly than their male counterparts. They tend to be more innovative, so more creative in helping others build a more innovative culture in their approach to leadership, and finally demonstrating more excitement, that emotional expression and that enthusiasm. So what's interesting in this space is we wanted to compare it to how men and women are in our broader research. So again, we do a lot of gender research. We do it based on global populations. We do it based on countries. We do it based on levels in the organization. So we have a very broad library of gender differences. So in taking a look at these entrepreneurial gender differences based on broader gender differences, we see some really interesting things. Higher empathy and higher excitement are consistent with our broader gender research. In the broader gender research, women in general, as leaders, tend to demonstrate more empathy and tend to demonstrate more excitement, more emotional expression. In our broader gender research, with technical and outgoing, so again, that technical expertise and again, outgoing, that more social way of engaging, there are not gender differences. So this is unique to this particular profile, that women would be higher, because the broader gender research generally shows no gender difference. With self, again, that autonomous thinking and engaging, and innovative, thinking in creative and new ways, more open to risk. In our broader gender research, those behaviors, we usually see men demonstrating them more. So this is a gender flip here, with women demonstrating them more than their male counterparts. All right, let's take a look at the men. Where are our men demonstrating more emphasis? So there are 4 behaviors here. With men, we see higher structuring, so that behavior associated with a disciplined way of approaching the work, being more organized. We see men higher on restraint, so more reserved in their emotional expression, more contained in the way they show emotion. We see men higher on persuasive, so building that compelling case, right? Really trying to sell and win people over. And then we see men higher on strategic, right? So that longer term thinking, really thinking about consequences, thinking more about the implications of actions before we take them. So this is interesting as well. So to Maria's point earlier, we're talking about higher emphasis, not high emphasis. So structuring, they're usually, when we look at the research in all kinds of different ways, usually there is no gender difference on structuring. When we do see a gender difference in the broader population, it's usually women who are higher on structuring. So this is a reminder here, while men are emphasizing structuring, male entrepreneurs are emphasizing structuring more than female entrepreneurs. They're both lower than the general leadership population on structuring. All right, so both a little bit less emphasis, but in comparison, men demonstrating more. The other three, restraint, persuasive, and strategic, very classically we see male leaders across broad sections demonstrating those three more. So again, more emotional reserve, where we traditionally see women more emotionally expressive. We see men, in this case, higher on persuasive. We see that generally. We also see men higher on strategic, thinking long-term, than we see with women. Again, back to higher emphasis versus high versus low. Both male and female entrepreneurs emphasize persuasive. The male entrepreneurs just tend to emphasize it a little bit more. All right, the next comparison we did was a generational comparison. So we looked at baby boomers versus Gen X. So of course, Gen Y or millennials are rapidly entering the leadership space, and so we'll look forward to being able to bring them on in the generational comparison, but we don't yet have enough millennial entrepreneurs in the database to actually compare them, but we do have enough baby boomers and enough Gen X to make a comparison. We actually have 178 baby boomers and 143 Gen X entrepreneurs. So let's take a quick look. There weren't huge differences here, but there were a couple of interesting ones to look at. So for baby boomers, we see them as more consensual, so more likely to seek out and use input from others. And we also see them as placing more emphasis on their deference to authority. So more aware and more careful about aligning with people in positions of authority. And sort of, you wonder, what is that for entrepreneurs? So in general, that's going to be your investors. It's going to be your board. Some entrepreneurs have partners, and that could also fit into that category as well. In some cases, it could be regulatory bodies where compliance is needed. So those are all elements where outside of the traditional organization, in the entrepreneurial space, we would see who would be considered authority. So in our broader generational research, baby boomers usually use consensual less than the Gen X folks. So this is a difference that we see in the entrepreneurial baby boomer space. And we generally see no difference between the baby boomers and Gen X in deference to authority. So again, this is a little bit unique to the entrepreneurial generational space. Let's take a look at the Gen X folks. So what we see with the Gen X folks is that they place more emphasis on production. So this is having really ambitious goals for results, really setting stretch goals and having high expectations for self and others. So we see Gen X higher than the baby boomers in this space. We see Gen X as more dominant, so more assertive in the way that they're leading. If used a lot, this can be seen as aggressive, but certainly is seen as more forceful. And then finally, again, while we see entrepreneurs across the spectrum as higher on technical, and observers seeing them even higher, relative to the baby boomers, the Gen X entrepreneurs are emphasizing technical more. This, in fact, these three are absolutely consistent with what we find in our broader generational differences. So when we look at the broad generational population, Gen X is, in all kinds of contexts, demonstrating higher production, more dominance, and higher technical than their baby boomer counterparts. So we are probably just as curious as you are to find out what will happen with the millennials in that space. So stay tuned as our database grows. We will be expanding this research. So over to you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Tricia. As I mentioned earlier, we wanted to end our presentation today by sharing with you sort of a combination of findings that highlight the hallmarks of entrepreneurial leadership, as this research has found, because there is a lot of interest in this, both by individual leaders, but also organizations that have incorporated this into their competency models. So here is our take on the hallmarks of entrepreneurial leadership. Please feel free to share anything else that you think stands out with us, and we can start a conversation that way. So in the path to entrepreneurship, what do leaders who want to be more entrepreneurial need to consider? Well, they need to work on selling ideas. Persuasion skills are important, and we see them over and over again in a lot of this research. Leaders should develop their persuasion skills and not assume that others will agree by default. Right? Don't assume that that agreement is coming. Determine how you can gain that and earn that from others. Entrepreneurs can build commitment. And excitement is one way that they probably do this, because excitement is contagious and gets people to commit to those ideas. So leaders should use excitement to get buy-in and get commitment to those ideas that they're presenting. And we've talked about the higher level of ideation, both in the question, the Q&A, and in our initial introduction to entrepreneurs. Learn to delegate. Delegating tasks gives others room to learn and grow, and can build support. So we know that entrepreneurs rely on their group of employees or colleagues to get things done. And so one way that you can build that support that you're going to need is by delegating. So helping entrepreneurs do this will be helpful. Entrepreneurs don't overemphasize rules and guidelines. And I think the main thing to take away from this is learn to be flexible. So we should help leaders who want to be more entrepreneurial to be flexible, not focus on rigid systems and guidelines, and be open to changing things up as needed. Not all the time, but if it's needed, they should have some sense of comfort around that. Be comfortable challenging authority. Don't always do it, but when you need to push back, right? Do it when you think that it is important. Now, with any change in leadership, you get some advantages, but you also have to watch out for those potential pitfalls. So what should we be helping leaders avoid as they become more entrepreneurial in their leadership? They need to make sure they're curbing the chaos. Change is good. Being comfortable with change is great, but too much change can leave others confused and unable to perform effectively. So we should help leaders find the right balance. Give enough freedom, but still maintain enough control so that it's not too chaotic around you. Invite ideas from others. It is important to maintain trust in one's expertise, but don't lose sight of other perspectives. We know that different people bring different ideas, different perspectives, and it's important to consider all of those. Where you can use your expertise, where leaders can use their expertise, is in evaluating those ideas to determine which ones are worthy of following through. Finally, maintain your social capital. Leaders who are interested in becoming more entrepreneurial should focus on their goals, but they should avoid this tendency to not reciprocate, to not help others achieve their own goals. So focus on your goals, but also make time to support others so that you're not giving others the impression that you are unwilling to lend a hand, and perhaps make them not want to lend a hand when you actually need it. So with that, I think it's time for a few more questions, maybe one or two. I'll let Lucy share some of the questions that we have.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, I know folks will be getting on with the next hour of their day pretty soon, but one or two we can answer, and then do keep an eye out for the blog post where we'll be able to answer those, and we'll reply to you personally as well. So one question about the study: were they all successful entrepreneurs, or were some of these failed entrepreneurs?
That is a great question. So we don't have outcome measures that would let us see success. We just focus on looking at the most basic definition of what an entrepreneur is, right? So it's someone who is out there on their own, starting something and leading an organization. As we collect more data, we will absolutely start thinking about ways that we can measure these outcomes, perhaps using leadership impact items, but it's a matter of waiting till we have a little more data. And as Tricia mentioned, this is our first set of studies looking at this. So with this feedback, we're going to generate some more research, and we'll be sharing that with you in the future.
Thanks. One other interesting question as we look at that 360 data, is it possible that the perspective of observers about their employers could be different for people who are working for an entrepreneur versus people who are working for a CEO? And would that potentially influence their perspective on the leadership?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's always possible, but the way that the LEA is structured, we're asking for things that are easy to observe and see. So as long as they have the opportunity to interact with that entrepreneur, that CEO or president who is an entrepreneur, they should be able to gauge those behavioral tendencies in a similar fashion. But I think it's possible. I just my initial instinct is that I would think it's unlikely. It's a small possibility.
Thanks. Let's go to our wrap up, just because I know folks are going to be getting on with their days, but I will say as we leave you, yes, the slides, the recording, and this terrific research summary that we have with a lot of the study details will all be made available to you. We'll send those via email, as well as a blog post that'll have the Q&A. So a lot of these questions that we weren't able to get to on the live broadcast, you'll see those questions and the answers in a blog post, along with just a wrap up of kind of what we learned today. So if you missed anything along the way, that'll all be provided to you. And just as far as what's coming up, I think Tricia mentioned briefly, but we're going to be offering a lot of free learning opportunities for everyone coming up. We're excited to continue connecting and learning with you all, from you all. So please keep an eye on our calendar. We're just getting that schedule up now, but we'll have a number of free webinars and learning sessions for people to use this time and continue connecting and learning productively. And we also have quite a few certifications coming up as well, including some that are friendly to Asia Pacific times. Probably most of those friends are not on this call right now, but and if you're looking to add certification to your calendar in the coming months as a learning opportunity, please get in touch with us. If you don't see something on our schedule that works, we're always excited and happy to work with folks to make sure we can find a way to work with you so you can use this time well. And I believe that's all we have. Keep up with us. Keep an eye on your inbox for that, the follow-up content. And thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to continuing to connect with you, and everybody, please stay well. Thank you so much.